Welcome. I'm Barbara Call, Senior Director of Content Strategy at IDG, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's video titled Best Practices for Patch Management, Protect Against Vulnerabilities, Gain Visibility, Reduce Downtime, and Increase Compliance, and brought to you by IDG, Tanium, and Verizon. Welcome, Chris. Tell us a little bit about your work at Verizon.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the director of the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center. So it's a specific group within Verizon that we consider to be kind of part of our security professional services, if you will, and really kind of harnessing a combination of the global footprint of professional services resources that we have all over the world to do everything from digital forensics, incident response, threat intelligence, governance, risk and compliance, as well as things like cyber hygiene, patching, as well as design, implementation, and management and operational type of services. And then all of that, one of the key things that we really try to bring to bear for our customers and all that we do is leveraging the giant Verizon backbone for purposes of enhanced intelligence and ability to operate at a global scale.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice to have you. And our second speaker is Eric Arnst, Technical Solution Engineer at Tanium. Welcome, Eric. Tell us a little bit about your role at Tanium.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks for having me. As you mentioned, I'm a technical solutions engineer, which is what a lot of other companies would call a sales engineer. So I get an opportunity to speak with many different prospects and customers from a pre-sales perspective to better understand their challenges and what they're facing. And I also demo Tanium and run production pilots and do those sorts of things on a pretty regular basis. And I'll also say this is my first time working at a vendor. I was previously on the customer side as Director of Information Security, where I was tasked with building out and running a SOC, which included vulnerability management. So I know firsthand how tricky that process can be.
Yeah. Okay, great. Nice to have you. So let's jump right into things. The latest 2021 Data Breach Investigations report from Verizon paints a somewhat sobering view of the growing volume of breaches, their impact, and so on. As the report states, quote, recent events around the world have been deemed by many to be sufficient cause to reevaluate their priorities, including, of course, security priorities. So, Chris, can you give us your view of the current data breach landscape?
Sure. Yeah. So I'd actually argue that the landscape has probably changed more in the last year than it probably has in most of the years preceding. And I've been doing this now for 20 plus years. So a lot of visibility into that threat landscape and kind of what it's, kind of gone up and down and how it's changed. And the reason I say that is because, COVID has caused rapid transformation across all businesses. Doesn't matter what you do, large business, small business, it has changed the way you operate. And also done that at great speed, right? I talk with a lot of CISOs on a regular basis. And in the early days of the pandemic, everybody was amazed at how fast we pulled together and re-architected an environment, migrated to the cloud, moved users to remote. However, one of the challenges that many of those CISOs also come back to me and say that they're concerned about is that with that great speed, what shortcuts did we take, right? They will come back and say, look, I know there are certain things we skipped or we did differently than we might otherwise do. And we figure we'll come back to that and address it later. Most important thing was that, we protect our people, and that all makes sense. But then there's the other concern of, what are the shortcuts that maybe the organization took or people took that we don't know about, right? We've often referred to these in a lot of our research as kind of the unknown unknowns. If we don't know it's there, how do we know to protect it or, secure against those kind of issues? And unfortunately, a lot of that stuff typically catches up to us. It's interesting. I look back on the early days of the pandemic, and if you look at, you referenced our DBIR, one of the things that we often see is that, there's a substantial lag between when an incident starts and when the victim realizes they've been breached. And over the course of the last couple of years, that has kind of ebbed and flowed, but we're looking at probably an 8 to 9 month lag. So when you consider the fact that when COVID hit, that probably also now has kind of an extended effect on that time because people aren't working the same way that they have. So little things like hygiene things, and maybe I shouldn't call them little because they're very important, but I think the industry tends to look at them as being simple problems to solve. But the downside of that is a lot of organizations tend to overlook the simple in chasing kind of the sexy, right? They're looking for the most exciting, advanced, sophisticated things to go after. and it may be the basic foundational things that ultimately get them in trouble. So, while I hate to kind of paint the negative picture, I'd honestly say that I think that, the cyber hygiene that was sacrificed to achieve those rapid transformations that I mentioned, that we're going to probably see the outcome of that manifest over the next couple of years in new and different types of breach events. And, if anyone's kind of skeptical about that, I'd say, kind of take a look back just at what we've seen happen over the course of the pandemic with things like, SolarWinds, Kaseya, Colonial Pipeline, Log4j being a most recent example of that. Those were all headline making cyber events. I think at a time where a lot of people thought, maybe cyber events were becoming common and people weren't talking about it or concerned about it. Now we're seeing all these new things kind of spring up. So, despite how all that might sound, believe it or not, I do consider myself to be an optimist. And I believe that there is a lot that we can learn from all of those type events, right? And I don't think these are impossible things to solve for, but obviously the first thing we need to do is kind of wrap our arms around that problem. And I think, the data that you referenced from our DBIR and that we've talked about a lot in the past, I think helps paint a good picture of what we really need to do.
Okay, great. Eric, I see you're nodding your head a lot. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I'm nodding because I totally agree with everything that Chris just said. I mean, he's spot on. And it feels like there's a new major vulnerability being announced every other week at this point. And organizations are just struggling to even identify how many endpoints they have, right? And so if you can't even identify how many endpoints you have to identify your exposure to those vulnerabilities, remediation becomes very tough as well. And I'm sure we'll get into it as this conversation progresses, and we'll talk about why that's been so difficult and maybe some of the strategies to get there. But yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and actually, if I could just jump in there real quick and just echo what Eric said there, I see that happen a lot when we go out and do breach investigations. We'll go out and we'll talk to the organization that we're trying to track down what a threat actor might be doing in their environment. And one of the first things that we usually run into is an organization's ability to even understand what assets they have, right? I say it's the most foundational level of everything security. Know what you have so you know what you can secure. And, just a recent event that occurred, and actually, we used Tanium to help illustrate this with the customer, was an event where they had a breach. They thought they knew their asset landscape. They came to us with what they thought that inventory looked like. And as we started rolling out patches, we could still see the threat actor moving around in the environment. And one of the things we did was we said, look, let's roll out Tanium. Let's do some asset discovery. Let's find out what's really out there. In that exercise, which, it probably only took us, I don't know, maybe 48 hours. We were able to identify over 30,000 additional assets that customer did not have any visibility into the existence, right? They had been going through mergers and acquisitions and all sorts of corporate actions. They really just kind of lost track of it. So the challenge then became of, if we're going to try and patch, I always really reinforce this with, if you say you're at 90% or 95%, the next question someone should ask is 90% or 95% of what, right? What is that denominator? And without that asset visibility, you can't expect to know what the percentage is.
Yeah. Excellent points. So, that's the reality of what today's IT and security pros are facing. But what does it really mean? Let's talk about what it means in terms of existing infrastructure, everyday actions and priorities, existing technology investment or future investment strategies, staffing, and so on. Chris, let's start with you again. What are your thoughts here?
Sure. Yeah. So excellent points, excellent questions. And with the cyber landscape evolving so rapidly, I think that is always going to be a changing answer. I'd say right now, what I would say is a couple of key things jump out at me when CISOs are asking me, what is it I should be looking at, focusing on, adding or improving? One of the first ones that jumps to mind is threat intelligence. That gives you situational awareness, right? When we look at security, if you design and manage your security just based on what you see happening, kind of, if you say within the four walls of your environment and talking to your own people, you're going to have a rather myopic view of what the threat landscape looks like. Something new is going to hit you, you're going to be unprepared, and you're going to fall victim to it, or you're going to have a real hard time. That threat intelligence allows you to see beyond your four walls. It allows you to learn what others are experiencing, maybe in other industries, in other geographies, in other risk factors. And then that allows you to block and tackle and take precautions to protect yourself so that when that hits you, it's not new and different, or you've got the blocking and tackling already in place. The other thing I would mention is, we see a lot of organizations, especially during the pandemic, looking to increase their staffing capabilities. And the challenge is the cyber landscape is super tight. Everywhere I go, everybody I talk to says they have trouble either finding people or keeping people or both.
Mm.
And, that's where I tell people, look, maybe the focus then is, how do you lean on partners? How do you lean on, strategic suppliers and vendors that may be able to help augment that? Things like IR retainers are super valuable in that way, because a lot of organizations, they're not experiencing breach events every single day, thankfully. But when they do happen, they need those resources really quick. In fact, I was having a conversation just earlier today where someone was asking, hey, how quickly can an organization expect to remediate and recover from a ransomware event? And if I use a third party, can I expect that that will happen faster? And we kind of walked through the scenario, and the example I gave them was, look, you may have great cyber people in your organization today. In fact, I'm sure you do. But the reality of it is, they're probably there because you hired them for a reason. They have a day job. They have objectives they need to be doing every day. You didn't just hire 10 people to sit and wait for a breach event. You hired those 10 people or 20 people or 100 people to do specific things. So when that event occurs and you now need to engage on an incident, you're pulling people off of whatever their cybersecurity day jobs were to now work on that incident, whether it's ransomware or something else. So it means you're making sacrifices in whatever it is all those people did before to bring them in to now run this incident. Maybe that's acceptable, but for a lot of organizations, they're already so tightly constrained on resources. It means they may very well be sacrificing something that could lead to the next event or could actually elongate this event. So bringing in those kind of strategic third parties to help, I think, is incredibly important in addressing that cyber talent gap. Plus, a lot of times there's maybe specialities that you need in terms of skill sets that it may just be very, very tough for an organization who doesn't deal with these things on a daily basis to even be able to keep that kind of talent on staff, year round. And then obviously, understanding that we see a lot happening on the geopolitical spectrum, right? You look at, what's happening, between Russia and Ukraine and kind of the bigger world stage right now. There's a lot in cyber that is seen as a proxy for either political or military action. So I expect to see that there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to have evolve around that. We're going to see potentially other types of exploitation of vulnerabilities or new 0 days emerge. And then the other thing I'd also mention is, Log4j is an event that, while it's now known for, several months, we expect that to have a really long tail. We expect there to be a tremendous amount of unpatched vulnerabilities as it relates to it, and a very long tail of exploitation to come. So really reinforcing the need for having a really solid cyber hygiene methodology.
Eric, you want to add anything there?
Chris is spot on. I'll say historically, organizations have adopted this multi-layer defense in depth strategy around security. And while that made perfect sense even just a few years ago, the threat landscape is changing dramatically. And so these days, most of the workforce working from home has made those same strategies not as effective. And so we'll talk about it more as we go through this, but I'll continue to make the point around the consolidation of tools and consolidation of infrastructure and how that will play into the ability to do the basic blocking and tackling, which has otherwise become very difficult with the changes we're seeing.
Right. Yeah. So some of the research shows that unpatched vulnerabilities continue to be a problem. And some of them are sitting unpatched for months or even years. So we've talked a little bit about the enterprises are still underperforming.
Yeah, and that really kind of ties back nicely to what I said before about the importance of cyber hygiene. A big piece of that includes patching. It may not be the sexiest part of security, as I mentioned before, but I can guarantee you it's absolutely one of the most important. Verizon, obviously a big player in the security industry, but many obviously know us as a large, internet service provider, or maybe we're your wireless phone provider. But that backbone gives us a tremendous view into what the threat landscape looks like, but more specifically, what we see happening in terms of vulnerability scanning, right? If you can have visibility into what goes back and forth across the internet, you can actually see what, say, threat actors are scanning for. What kind of vulnerabilities are they trying to find? And we see a tremendous amount of network activity that is just associated with looking for unpatched vulnerabilities. And maybe some of that are legitimate security teams looking to try to find and solve those problems. But a lot of that we know is threat actors scanning for unpatched vulnerabilities, because when they find those unpatched vulnerabilities, it can be almost trivial for them to exploit them and completely take over the systems and their connected infrastructure. So, I think that, helps kind of paint a picture of why the strong patch management and proper performance is really important.
Great. Eric, anything you'd like to add?
I just like to say, I love that Chris made the point earlier that even getting to a 90% patch efficacy, which by the way is what most organizations tell me they're getting to. When I ask the question, what's your patch efficacy? Like basically I'm asking at the end of the month, what percentage of patches were you able to get out there effectively? And it's almost become a running joke for me that almost everybody tells me, it's somewhere between 90 and 95%, almost without fail, 90 to 95%. But as Chris said, it's 90 to 95% of the 80% of the machines they knew about, of the places where the agent is working, of the patches that they approved to go out. And once we go in there and look with Tanium, we find that their number was much more like 70 to 75%. So there's major gaps there. There's major gaps. And I feel like the reason these organizations are not able to get these patches out successfully is really twofold. And Chris already touched on it to some degree. The first is that they're using old legacy tools that just weren't built for today's global networks and the remote workforce and all of the size and scale of networks that we're seeing these days. And so they just don't work as well as they used to, as I said before. And really, they weren't working that well to begin with. And so with all of these changes, they've even further broken down. And the other part of that is that in order to maintain those legacy tools and keep them at all functional, takes a lot of time. And the time it takes to triage patching at the end of the month to fix issues that are preventing patches from going out there successfully is also very time consuming, and therefore it becomes very difficult to staff for those things. And understand that this is just a small part of most system administrators' jobs, or should be, right? But because of the importance of patching, and because of the time-consuming nature of it, they end up spending an inordinate amount of time on this one aspect of their job. And some other things, more interesting tasks around engineering and around improving the network, are falling by the wayside. So if they could just find the time to be freed up from this kind of mundane but super important task of patching, they could go do those improvements that are otherwise not getting done.
You're teeing me up perfectly to ask for, what's the solution? And Chris, tell us about Verizon Patching as a Service. How does it work and what are the benefits?
Yeah, so the Verizon Patching as a Service really kind of helps customers address this whole big concern, and we do it by leveraging Tanium's technology combined with Verizon's services. So I think that's a huge leg up. And one of the things that I always talk to organizations, and it dovetails nicely with what Eric said as well, is we can't be looking at this the way we looked at it in the early 2000s or the 90s or even the 80s. There's a lot of organizations, they are still using those same legacy tools today to try to address patching in environments where those tools are probably not even fully applicable. With patching as a service here, with that combined Verizon Tanium approach, customers can expect faster patch cycles and more comprehensive patch cycles. They can actually understand when we say 95%, or even better, let's say 99% or 99.9%, we can actually also tell them this is what the denominator is, because we can actually go out there with that same platform using Tanium to actually identify what all the assets are. So there's no question as to what the denominator or the total scope of assets are, and then also our patch success rate. So, I mentioned faster cycles, more comprehensive patching, also able to leverage our insights from our threat intelligence, that I described earlier, to actually also look at things like patch prioritization. A lot of organizations may be facing, hey, when a patch cycle runs, there may be a lot of things that need to be addressed. How do we actually automate and orchestrate and ensure that the most important things, the most impactful things to our business are getting addressed right up front? Something that maybe is less of a concern, maybe can move its way down the stack. So that prioritization of it is also important. And then also obviously working closely with the business to understand, hey, there may be certain patch windows, certain things need to fall into. That is really our sweet spot in terms of being able to work with organizations through whatever those critical time periods are. And then, back to what Eric said, of course, is it also helps organizations focus their internal resources on other priorities that may more directly align with what their actual business operations are, rather than, hey, everybody drop everything you're doing. We need to put a full court press on this patching issue, we can actually say, look, the patching will happen. That is now a BAU process because, Verizon and Tanium are on it with this particular service. And obviously, I'm also a fan of this approach, not just from the patching standpoint, but because Tanium just as a platform is something that can really enable and unlock other value, as well for customers. I think Eric said it really well before that, customers need to be looking at ways that they can slim down the technology, the endpoint agents, and all the different things that they're using in their environments so that they can more focus on their business. And also with the talent pool being as tough as it is, do you want to have a staff this big in order to manage all those agents, when maybe you can say, look, by leveraging fewer agents, we can consolidate also our resources and our expertise and have, maybe a higher degree of subject matter experts as well that can, like I said, really unlock more value or ROI from your spend.
Barbara, I just want to run with something that Chris just started touching on at the end there. If I could make one suggestion to all organizations, having now been on the customer side and getting a chance to talk to a lot of different customers and seeing what's leading to some of these struggles that they're having, my suggestion would be consider moving to a platform for endpoint management. Most companies have all grown used to the idea that they have to have a point solution for everything. They end up having a tool that does vulnerability management, another one to do the patching, and another one to do the sensitive data discovery or incident response or file integrity monitoring or performance monitoring. Like the list goes on and on and on. But each of those tools has its own infrastructure, and it has its own training requirements, and it has its own maintenance costs and its own agent and its own data sets, which often don't align with each other, right? And so overall, there's just a ton of complexity and cost that is unnecessary. And it's solved by moving to a platform, quite honestly. And the other thing is, all of those point solutions are supposed to be making their visibility better. But what ends up happening is they actually make it worse. The complexity that's being added there actually makes the visibility worse, and you can't trust the data coming back from them. And as we talked about up front, there's really nothing more important than the visibility. The visibility lends itself to all of those other tasks that are being needed in the environment, such as the patching. It's probably the most fundamental thing in IT. Without that visibility, like I said, it's impossible to successfully secure the environment or to respond to threats or what have you. And so every vendor wants to sell you their latest whiz-bang thing to solve the visibility problem. But again, I would suggest consolidation of tools rather than adding yet another thing that's only likely to make the problem worse.
Great advice. Before we close, one last question. I want to make sure we touch on Verizon plus Tanium. What's the value of this partnership? What's different from your competitors?
So, I mean, I'll jump in there and say that, I think it's been a strategically important partnership and alliance for us for many years. We've actually been in this relationship for quite a long time, started in areas of, breach investigations, and now has really permeated. And, I would say, the Verizon services and kind of Tanium technology interlock now are across the board. We're using it in most, if not all of our security services today. So I'd say that's a huge piece, is that we bring a lot of subject matter expertise to the table, combined with a lot of great technology, as well as the fact that we've got a great global footprint. So organizations anywhere in the world, wherever it is they're headquartered, wherever it is they may have satellite locations or remote workers or whatever the need may be, the combination of the technology and the people that we bring, I don't think that there's anybody that can match that. And then you add in, as I mentioned before, the visibility that Tanium brings at the endpoint level and the visibility that Verizon brings at the backbone level, that really kind of gives you a good 360-degree view of that threat landscape and your asset inventory.
Awesome. Eric, anything you want to add?
Not much. I mean, Chris said that one perfectly, and not much to add there. But I will say I've now worked with Verizon as a customer, and also I've had the pleasure of working with them from a partner perspective as well, and it's been nothing but great for me. So appreciate that, Chris.
Appreciate that, Eric.
Thanks, Chris and Eric. That was great. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to say thank you to my guests. Chris Novak is Global Director of the Threat Research Advisory Center at Verizon, and Eric Arntz is Technical Solution Engineer at Tanium. And thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. For more information, reach out to the email on your screen or visit the resource section. For IDG, Tanium, and Verizon, I'm Barbara Call.